Welcome to this short series of seminars on involving farmers around the research cycle. Let me explain what this topic is about. Our program has been working with farmer research networks for a number of years, and we have principles for how farmer research networks are supposed to operate. The important principles for this discussion are around the way the research is done, and they include farmers co-creating the research agenda. They involve the principle that farmers are involved throughout the research. That means co-developing the research plans. And research should be based on sound, appropriate, and participatory designs and protocols, and should include relevant local or indigenous farmer knowledge, and that knowledge being integrated into the research. All these are principles about trying to capture the way that we believe that farmers should be involved in the research, and not just involved in prioritizing problems and picking what we're going to work on topic X, but in other stages of the research as well. And yet, when researchers try and do this, and when we talk to researchers who have tried to do this, then we often get reactions about, wait a minute, is this rigorous? It's just how can you involve, we want to work with large numbers of farmers. How can we involve all those in all these things when there's thousands of farmers involved? What actually are the approaches and methods that we can use? Because this all looks a little bit different from what we learnt about research methods when we were studying soil science or agronomy or crop breeding or whatever it was. And the bottom line to many of these worries is, hey, we can't publish the results of this sort of research. And a feeling even that it's sort of not even proper research if you can't publish it. One reason everybody, your institutes, other scientists, etc., pay attention to science publishing is it provides a sort of check on the credibility of what you're doing. If you can't publish, does that mean there's something not credible about what you're doing? So we need to somehow sort of resolve these two, the upper half and the lower half of the screen here. The principles say farmers should be involved, fully involved at all stages, and yet sometimes it seems rather difficult. So that's what we're going to look at in this series. Just some of the ways, some of the implications, and some of the approaches and tools we have for really making this integration work. I looked at what we've been doing in the region, and I think the last time we had a workshop that focused explicitly on this topic was in 2018. It was a face-to-face workshop in Nairobi, and I looked at the list of the participants in that 2018 workshop, and only about a quarter of them are still engaged with what is now CRFS. So, it's clearly time to look at this topic again, even though we have looked at it before. And maybe that's why the East Africa COP meeting asked for this topic as something that Research Methods Support tries to cover in the seminar series. So that's the sort of basis for picking this topic. And what we want to do during these 4 sessions is generally increase understanding about what the issues are and what's possible, demonstrate some of the practical research methods. I think particularly look at the way some of the standard research designs and assumptions about them have to be changed when we're engaging in this deep way with farmers. So many of you, I know, learned about experimental designs, for example, when you were studying, and you learned about the importance of replication and randomization and having controlled treatments and things like that. All that gets a bit distorted or changed when we have farmers deeply engaged. And what are the implications of that? That's one of the things we want to look at. And throughout all this, we will try and draw on your experiences and your knowledge, and not just tell you what we in Research Methods Support Project are thinking. So the 4 topics. In the first one, I thought it would be a good idea just to look again at the research cycle, what we mean by the research cycle. because the overall heading refers to all stages of the research cycle. So we need to make sure that we're all on board with what that research cycle is and why it's important. We then, in the second session on the 4th of April, we focus on research design. In the third one, we'll focus on measuring and data collection and handling data. And in the fourth one, we look at analysis and interpretation of data and results. And in all of them, we'll try and mix it up a bit with some presentations and discussions and maybe some kind of practical exercises. And I hope plenty of opportunity for questions which you bring up, either questions that we can answer during the session or questions that we need to answer later on. And in particular, there might be things that come up today, questions that arise today, which we can try and answer in the remaining sessions of this series. So I hope that's acceptable. All right. So first step is, what is this research cycle? And there are lots of ways in which this is described and represented. And here's the sort of most basic one. And this has been described as the scientific method. This is when people first started thinking about how science works in the 16th century. Francis Bacon essentially wrote down this, and they said, this is what we do. It's a cycle, so we can start anywhere on it. But let's start at the top. You make some sort of observation, whether that's formally collecting data or just observing something in the world. It doesn't matter. And then you reflect on that, you think about it and say, what does it mean? And the what does it mean bit is expressed as some kind of generalization, a rule, maybe a rule, a scientific rule. How does the world work? So we generalize, and we have to test whether that generalization is really valid. Are we getting a correct sort of understanding? So we plan some kind of study which will allow us to validate or test that generalization. We plan, we get a new set of observations, and we go around the cycle again. So if you're an experimental scientist, then your plan is an experimental design. Your observation is when you put the experiment into practice and collect data. The reflection bit is when you do your analysis and say, what does this mean? The generalization bit is when you formulate some new hypotheses about whatever you're working on and put another plan in place, another experiment to check the new hypotheses. And if you look at those 4 steps, the upper 2 here are sort of operational. They're things we sit down and do. And the lower 2 here are conceptual. They're really based on the way we understand things working. And that cycle was the way science was described for a long time. That's called single loop learning. We learn it in that way because there's a single loop here. And then somebody noticed, and I couldn't say who was first one to think of this. They said, actually, we can go around this circle, but there are points when we're going around a circle when we profoundly change the way we think about the problem or the issue. We change the conceptual frame we're using and start thinking about it in a different way. And that extra loop that comes in here is sometimes called double loop. It's a second loop, and so we now have double loop learning. So if you think about our kind of business, when people stopped thinking about soil as a sponge for nutrients, that soil is a sponge and you put nutrients in and plants take them out, that's the way that soil science thought about soil for, I don't know, about 150 years or so. Then more recently, people started saying, hey, that isn't actually what soil is. Soil is a complicated sort of living system with all sorts of different components. And when you think about it as a sponge, you're missing a whole lot of the way that soil functions. And that change from thinking of soil as a sponge for nutrients to thinking of soil as a complicated system with a chemical component, a physical component, and a biological component, and all these things working together and influencing each other. That was a change in conceptual thinking about soil, and it leads to different sorts of hypotheses and different kinds of experiments and different kinds of observations and measurements. Okay, so there's the sort of first, any scientist would recognize that research cycle there. Then we think about the way that we do work with communities and farmers. It's most often it's around problems, and we're trying to solve problems. Collectively, we're trying to solve farmers' problems. We're trying to look at things which are not working well and trying to find ways of improving them and so on. And so we know why participation in that sort of action is necessary. The action that's involved might not just be an experimentation, a formal experiment or other piece of research. We could just decide we're going to do something, we're going to try and do something different and see what happens. So the general participatory action research framework is one that says there's a problem or a question, and we decide what to do, some action. We observe what happens when we do that, and we reflect and say, what does it mean? Is this going in the right direction, or do we need to try something else? And then we go around that loop again. So it's sort of similar to that research cycle, but it's phrased in terms of taking action and seeing what happens when you take that action. And that's commonly used, commonly understood. If we think about our Farmer Research Network research cycle, then it's sort of got a little bit of, it's got elements of both those two things in there. Typically, what we're doing is something like this. There's a piece at the top about engaging, getting farmer research networks together, establishing the relationships between farmers and researchers and those other people. There's a step of understanding the context, what's going on here. You can't do useful work in a farmer research network without really understanding the background to the farming system in that place, and the background to the people involved and their interests and motivations, etc. There's a piece of background understanding, but at some point we get to talking about the questions or the problems or the options that we want to work on. We figure out an approach to doing the research, and we figure out details of a design. It might be an experiment, but it doesn't have to be. There are all sorts of research that farmer research networks can do. There's some data collection. There's some data analysis. There's then looking at what we've got, understanding it, interpreting it, and deciding what to do next, and going on around the cycle. So there's a sort of general picture of what FRNs do. And that first one has all sorts of points in there about choosing and prioritizing and finding who is interested and mobilizing and so on. The second step means figuring out, okay, what are we going to compare with what? The simplest case is when farmers choose to do an experiment where they compare alternative options side by side. But there are other types of things going on as well. For example, we have projects which are trying to understand how pests and diseases are influenced by landscape structure. And you can't do experiments in that. You do observational studies. We have people who are doing observational studies on how women are engaged, or how we can support youth start up new businesses. There's all sorts of different things going on. Whatever it is, we need to figure out what's the type of the research, how are we going to assess what's going on, how are the research or the plots in the field or whatever it is, how is it going to be managed, etc. We have to look at what to measure, who is going to do the measuring, how is the data going to be recorded, how is it going to be handled. The data handling in FRN type research can be an interesting thing to try and understand, because there are all sorts of options, from farmers just keeping their own data to somehow, technicians go around and collecting all the data and bringing it all together, and all sorts of variations on that. Those need negotiating and understanding. We have the analysis. As scientists, we often think of data analysis as running some statistical analyses and getting some tables and graphs out of it. That's not the only approach to data analysis, and it's not the only way we would analyze data within an FRN, because often those statistical analyses and numbers are not the things that are most informative to the farmers we're working with. But there's some step there of making sense of the data, and in particular, understanding the variation. One of the characteristics of nearly all the data we collect is that it's variable. You don't see the same thing everywhere. You see all sorts of variation, and trying to figure out what's going on, what's the information that's hiding in the variation. That's an important part of data analysis. And then this one of figuring out what next, choosing what the next action is. It might be, okay, we've now really solved this problem, and we're going to look at the next problem on our list. It might be that solving this problem gives us opportunities that weren't there before. It might be that we haven't solved the problem at all and we need to try again. There are all sorts of different outcomes, but whatever those outcomes are, you're going to be starting this cycle again. So now what we're looking at is saying, all right, we want to involve farmers in all those steps. How do you do that? Or even, why do you do that? And there are several reasons for trying. They're to do with empowerment. It's a right, isn't it? If we're intervening in things that are really important to farmers, then they have a right to be involved in decisions about that. So that means we're trying to take joint decisions. It's not that researchers are going to say, this is the research design you're using, this is the data that's going to be collected, here are the results that I've analyzed that you can now use. There should be joint approaches to all these things, and those joint approaches are going to involve negotiation. There will inevitably be different perspectives, different views on what's a useful or correct thing to do at each of these stages, and some sort of negotiation is going to be involved. So what we're going to be looking at during this whole series is, how can we involve farmers? What sort of decisions are taken? What's the basis for taking some of those decisions? How can you negotiate? And what sort of research designs and data collection and data analysis sort of options and tools do you have available to deal with all of that?
One quick question. I'm thinking, based on my personal experiences and challenges with this, is sometimes it might be me that needs the adjustment, not so much the process or the steps, but what is, I mean, I know, Rick, where it's like, okay, put your magician hat on and change us all. But if you could, suggest some approaches to get farmers engaged so that they are excited and committed. I guess that's the challenge.
Okay, no, that's a good point. I think I agree. It is a challenge, and I also realize that me and my colleagues in the research methods project are probably not the best people to answer that question. The best people to answer that question are those people that sort of do it for a living. So maybe that will come out of the discussion that we're going to have in just a minute. Okay, so what I would like to do now is we're going to go into some small groups. So Shifa, I hope you can set that up. And just look at your experiences and ideas. So here are the five, in the way that I've described a research cycle, that one of problems and questions, the approach and design, measurement and data collection, analysis, interpretation. And for each of those, just think, what have you tried? I'd really like, for example, to hear that anybody that's tried to involve farmers in data analysis. So what have you tried? And if you haven't tried anything, why not? What do you see as the blockages? You can add comments here on what went well. And a nice example of something that seemed to be really effective, or alternatively, examples of places where it seemed to be difficult, it didn't work, or you've got serious question or reservations about it. So we'll go into groups. There should be somebody in each group that has access to basically this slide online, and we just capture some notes in it, and then we'll look at the notes that come up from each group and talk about them. All right,
Yes,
where's
okay.
yes, in the research cycle, is it possible to have additional questions at data collection stage that were not considered during question stage? Right. Okay. You know, I've been simplifying enormously. And one of the ways I've simplified the presentation is implying that we just go round and round that loop. And in practice, we're always going to be iterating. You might be taking a shortcut. So if we think of this as a cycle here, there are all sorts of ways in which you go back to an early step before you've gone all the way around the cycle. For example, you come up with a question and you start working on the design. And as you work on the design, you realize that the question maybe is not quite right, or doesn't make sense, or even can't be answered. So you go back and update the question and try again. Or yes, you might be busy collecting data. And as you're collecting data, you realize there's something happening that you'd forgotten to collect data on, or didn't realize that you'd need to collect data on, and you decide you're going to start collecting some more data. So you're doing a bit of design and then going on to data collection. So yes, it's unusual actually just to go round and round this cycle without sometimes like taking a shortcut back and looking again at the design, or data analysis stage, you might say, we didn't get the right data. We're going to try and collect some more data and come back to here and do it again. So yes, there are ways, the reasons for, let's say, iterating or taking some shortcuts rather than going around the whole loop each time. Maybe in your group you might like to talk about when that happens. So what we'll do is we will we'll just go through group by group, looking at what they've put, and just ask someone from that group to pick up some of the key things. Maybe the person who did the recording can pick up one or two key things that you'd like to highlight, and we'll see whether anybody has reactions to them or questions. Yeah, who was in group one? Who's going to just summarize some highlights from group one? That's what's on the screen now.
That was me, Rick, taking notes for group one. So I'm just realizing that I've got the room camera rather than my own camera. It was the beginning of a really interesting discussion, but too short. There are some aspects that caught my attention, and please, I would ask my colleagues to correct me if I got them wrong and to enrich the contribution. The first one is that the discussion of problems seems to be very much engaging with farmers, and there's value in doing that, because there is an opportunity for prioritization and an opportunity also for getting farmers motivated. There are some issues there, and it is that if the discussion is had and eventually resources are not available to go into those areas, farmers' expectations have created. So we actually need to make sure that we can deliver. The second thing that I found interesting is that it seems that in this group, the two contributions on who designs and how the approach is proposed is mainly from the side of researchers who go and design. There are consultations with farmers and opportunity for modification, but that is led by researchers. And some areas of work are easier to design, co-design. The next issue is that in terms of what farmers are interested in engaging with might not be exactly the same that what researchers are interested in doing. And there is an awareness that some of those things have to be done by the researchers and not by the farmers. Then it is interesting to me on the analysis side that there are two levels. There is an analysis with farmers, an analysis of researchers, and I find that quite natural because questions might be common in some cases, but there are also questions that are particular for each of the groups. And the analysis with farmers is in groups and consultative. There are challenges in sharing the results that come from the more conventional type of analysis that researchers do. And there is this comment that on the analysis side, at least one of the members of our group said that the analysis that are done with farmers are not suitable for sharing and engaging in discussions with researchers. So it is seen as two very different levels of. But this was only one person, and we didn't have time to go deeper into the process. But thank you.
That's really nice. So, okay, let's go on to group 2. Who's going to say something about this?
I think that'll probably be me. I realized after now seeing the other group's notes that we didn't really have a discussion as such. We had some examples presented, so maybe I'll just 3 examples were presented. I probably won't talk much about the Andes one because I don't know it as well, and it's probably less known by the people here. So 2 of the ones that we were talking about was Charles's experiences with working with farmers in identifying agroecological markets. And then another one from the best bets from Isaac, which was farmer involvement in identifying ways to improve soil fertility for sorghum and soil health in general. So I guess I'm trying to pull out general topics, but both of them, it seemed to be that involving farmers in the problem stage was very successful. It did, once you later on then getting the results, it seems less. Charles experienced some surprise at what they ended up finding, so that was quite interesting. As researchers, what they expected to be the preferred markets was not what the farmers came up with. So I think both projects had good experiences with involving farmers at the beginning and also in the design. You know, there are challenges with some of the designs in terms of, because farmers could choose exactly what they wanted to test, particularly for the best bets, then, you know, that can make it challenging to compare and group, but they were able to group and compare different types of farmers and different types of legumes that they were testing. The analysis stage, I didn't hear from Charles exactly how they did the analysis. I think it was a lot of discussions and sort of having long lists of markets and then final lists. For the best bets, it was, they had some researcher analysis that was conducted, and then they had farmer results that were collected for, well, data that the farmers had collected and also their perception. And then they sort of brought the two analyses together, if I understood rightly. And with that one, then they could also talk to the farmers about, right, so what next? So that seemed to be very good. Okay. But if any of my colleagues,
any quick,
yeah.
well, yeah. any comments or questions from anybody at all?
Yeah, I have a question about bringing the two together, the research and the farmers' comments. I'd be interested to hear if maybe an example of how that was done, both in terms of presenting it to the farmers, but also how you reported it in your write-up.
I think, can we ask Isaac? Isaac, go ahead.
Yeah, okay. First comment, Jane, the legumes are rotated with maize, not sorghum. Coming to the question, the farmers have their own observations that they make, and at the end of the season, we sit down and discuss. We call them feedback sessions. So we look at what farmers observed in terms of performance of different treatments, then versus the data that we have analyzed, and see what the data is saying. Then in the end, see how the two are linking and map way forward together. What intervention can we take to the larger fields? Yeah.
Isaac, have you ever come across like a contradiction between a farmer's conclusion and your conclusion based on the same experience?
No, but I think some variations based on context from one area to another, maybe. This treatment is doing better in this area, or maybe this season, then come another season, this treatment is doing better this area, and so on. Yeah, but usually there's that alignment where farmers observe exactly what the data is also saying.
Okay, so generally you get alignment. So I think that's something that goes well if you generally get alignment. Yeah. Okay, we're going to move to group 3.
I will say that, and then my group could add any comments that I missed. So I think in our group we had a few people who have engaged farmers in mostly problem solving, like problem identification and questions, and identifying of questions, where some use like hosting of roundtables for family, like hosting of roundtables via farmer conferences, and also conducting FGDs to facilitate the problem identification. But one of the things that came up was that came as interesting in our group was in that farmers coming up with issues that researchers have no ability to contribute to.
Do you have an example of such an issue?
Yeah, so I will actually ask Lucy to comment on that and give us the example.
It was in an inception meeting actually a couple of weeks ago with a project that had, they had invited farmers to the inception meeting so that, the new phase of their grant. But when we asked the farmer what issues they were having with this particular crop, they didn't mention anything about fertility of soil or anything that the researchers had planned to do in their project. They mentioned manpower and the difficulties of harvesting and processing that particular crop.
How did the project respond to that?
Yeah, well, I think they're going to think it through.
Right.
Their immediate response was, "Oh, we don't do that. That's not, we're doing this in this project."
That is an interesting challenge because, of course, manpower and etc. is a perfectly legitimate area to do research and action and intervention on. Yeah. So maybe it's interesting then that the project was formulated without the farmers' involvement. Okay, Nuru, back to you. Anything else you'd like to highlight from this group?
Yeah, okay. And with the other aspects like measurement and data collection, there was an example from the Best project where they've been involving farmers in using in collecting plot level data through ODK in their tablets. And though an issue that came up from there was that there was still the building of trust between researchers and farmers, and researchers thinking that farmers would not collect very credible data. So there was always that issue of balancing, like how much should we trust of the data that is being collected by farmers. And that's so far where we ended within our group. Okay,
that was very good. I think there's something which we do need to look at in future sessions on two things. One is point about trust, and building trust has to be part of relationship between farmers and researchers. And the other is, what is credible data? And is a researcher's concept of what makes credible data aligned with what farmers think is credible data? And if not, why not? What's the difference? Why do we as researchers think that maybe our data is more credible than data that farmers produce? Carlos.
I just wanted to share one of the experiences that we had in the Andes, where farmers were interested in a number of aspects of their production system, and the researchers didn't affect that agenda, but joined in as partners rather than leaders. And so I think it shows the spectrum of what FRNs can do, and not always, but in some cases, farmers are able to take the lead and researchers go as supporters. And it just is a different type of learning experience and a different type of research question. And that's one of the beauty of FRNs, and is the wide variety of research questions that it allows to understand. And it will be very different from the research that is mainly negotiated or led by researchers.
So that's a really important point there. One of the features of FRN should indeed be the way that they're coming around together around jointly negotiated and understood problems. Vicky.
Yeah, I think maybe we could also reach out to our senior, I don't mean age, I mean in ranking, persons who are on various boards, journal boards, to help them understand the value of farmer participatory research. There are a few journals that are embracing that as a main theme, but there's so many that are not. And so that's, I think, part of the scientist, it gets to, okay, how many publications means how much, how you are evaluated at the end of the year by your job. And so therefore it's up to us to try to retrain the journal editorials of the priorities and how to embrace good research.
Yep. Okay, I think we've got a big topic here on what formulates good research, what constitutes research that can be written up and published. And I agree that often it's not that there's anything wrong or unpublishable about results coming out of work in FRNs. The problem lies in the sort of expectations of journals and publishers as to what good data looks like, and our data doesn't look like that, but that doesn't mean that it's not valuable to write up. I'm going to just say something briefly from Group 5. And the first thing we see is that I can't count. It was actually Group 4, but I filled it in as Group 5. So we focused on these two steps of measurement and analysis, and projects that described ways in which farmers are involved in measurement. And I thought it was interesting that it was sort of researcher-led, but then with farmer additions. In other words, farmers described what to record and why, and hoped that researchers described what they thought needed recording and why, and hoped that this would be convincing to farmers. And farmers then did two things. One, they added some additional things that they were interested in themselves, but they also said, some of this data is just too tedious to collect. We're not going to do that. It's too long. And presumably they thought it was unimportant. So for example, counting the number of plants in a plot, researchers thought that was important to know what the stand was in plots, and farmers think it's unimportant and too tedious to do. They did identify a problem of measuring when there's lots of farmers. What are the mechanisms for taking measurements, whether farmers are collecting the data or somebody else is collecting the data? When there are a lot of people involved, trying to keep on top of all that is a challenge. And there was an interesting one that came up in analysis. So they described doing analysis with researchers showing the results, sharing the results they've got, or their interpretation with farmers, and farmers describing their own interpretation and understanding, and generally a good agreement between these. But a problem noticed when in some places where what farmers were doing was not quite what they negotiated or wanted to do, because extension workers were telling them that's not the way to do it. That maize should be grown in this way, and farmers wanted to do it differently, but extension workers were interfering and trying to put pressure on farmers to do it a different way, and that was making. I mean, it brought up here with analysis that it made it difficult to analyze the results. Now, there's clearly lots on these slides already. The discussions seem really squeezed, as they always are in these, but there's clearly a lot there. And after the session, I'm going to go through this carefully and pick up some topics that we need to cover in the future sessions. But what I'd like to do in the remainder of this one is just go through a few things, really three points that seem to me particularly important, and that they weren't quite coming up in that discussion, and so I would like to have time to highlight them now, and just explore three key ideas which I believe are really important, the reasons for and the way we involve farmers in all stages, not just in design or just in problem identification or just in analysis, but really in all those stages around the research cycle. And the first one is this idea of co-creation. We hear co-creation, co-learning, co-development as something we should be doing. But let's just be clear on first why, what it means, and why it is so important. It means that those choices, what we're learning, choices about design, decisions on action, are jointly made by all the participants in the FRN. They're not researchers, and they're not farmers, or they're not the extension officers. They're jointly made. That co-bit means, what does it mean? Together. And it means that farmers, researchers, anybody else engaged in the activity are doing these things together. It's not one leading and another following. It's not just consultation. It's really a joint effort. And it's been emphasized in much writing about agroecology. If you look at what have become the sort of standard description of agroecology principles, that's Vessel et al. 2020, that co-creation of knowledge is one of the 13 principles they list. Enhancing co-creation, horizontal sharing of knowledge, including local and scientific innovation, especially through farmer to farmer exchange. So co-creation is an important point there. There's been a lot of thought about why this is important. And I think there are two elements of it. There are two reasons why it comes so strongly in descriptions of agroecology. The first one is it's a value. It's just saying we value empowering farmers. Farmers have a right to be involved in things that influence them. It's a way of ensuring inclusivity. You think about what you as a researcher are doing in this, you're poking in somebody's livelihood. And if you think about what it would mean if you were the farmer in there and somebody's coming and trying to poke in your livelihood and tell you what to do, you'd somehow like to be involved in that and have some say in it and some influence in the way they're trying to push you. And so the idea of co-creation and co-learning it's embodying that value, that it's just a basic right to have some say in determining what goes on. That little bit of Latin in the pink box there, nihil de nobis sin nobis, it means nothing for us without us. And it was a sort of slogan that's been picked up by many different groups throughout history, but it's first recorded historically in 14th century in some European kingdoms where the common people were telling that to their kings, basically. You can't do things for us without involving us. And that's exactly the same principle applies now. So that's the first reason. And the second reason is it also supports effective research. Because those farmers have, we know, all sorts of knowledge and experience. You have to bring that in to make sure that what you're doing is relevant and useful, that what you're doing really is applicable in the specific context you're working. You also need to bring in these multiple perspectives on anything. You can, for example, look at a new practice and say, this is working. You can look at a new variety of sorghum and say, this performs very well. But your perspective as a researcher is only one possible perspective. And when somebody else looks at it from a different perspective, they might come to a very different conclusion. So we look at it and say it doesn't get diseases and it gives a high yielding. And they can look at it and say, yeah, but it's really difficult to thresh and it tastes horrible. So multiple perspectives will give you new insights as to what's really going on. And therefore, if you've brought this context specificity and you brought in the views of farmers well into the design of what you're doing, you're going to reduce those barriers to using the results, having an impact, moving things to scale, and so on. So co-creation, it's both just a basic principle, almost like a human right, and it also supports doing really effective research. The second one is on the difference or relationship between research and learning. And I wanted to pick up this because we sometimes say, you know, farmers are doing research, but oh, well, they're just experimenting on something that we already know the answer to. So is that research? You say, well, maybe we call that one learning. Farmers are acquiring new knowledge. We already knew it, but now they're learning it. The more I think about it, I come to the conclusion that there really isn't a clear boundary between learning and research. So research, discovery of new knowledge using systematic processes, learning, acquiring new knowledge, understanding and skills, they overlap a lot. Researchers and farmers and everybody else are learning all the time as they do things, and they're contributing to research in what they do. So trying to draw a border between research and learning is not very helpful. And I was going to go through an example there. Here's one. It's a sort of simplified example, but based on work that some of you have done. Researchers do experiments that show that growing lab can reduce striga infestation in subsequent crops. So what happens? We've got that. It's a great result. It looked really promising. So farmers do a trial in which they try the same things and they get the same result. Now, sometimes we say, okay, the first one is the experiment. We write that up as a scientific paper. The second one is just farmers learning the same thing. We don't need to write that up as a research result because it was already known. But if you do it carefully, farmers will also, in the same time, learn about other things as well. They will learn about other properties of lab, not just the fact that it controls striga. And together, they will demonstrate that this practice of growing lab in this way is really a practical strategy to manage striga and do some other things, improve your soil health and produce some edible legumes and produce some fodder or mulch, etc., etc. And they will also demonstrate that this doesn't work all the time for everybody. There are going to be specific conditions when it is useful and maybe sometimes when it isn't useful. And they can assemble data then on the social, environmental, and economic effects of including lab. That could be, if it's done well, really important results, really important data that could be written up and published. And yet it's based on this farmers learning things and researchers learning things in the same set of activities. Okay, it's not that the researchers doing their research somehow separately from what farmers are doing. You know, based on that, farmers and researchers then identify further questions, go around the research cycle again. In the past, I've tried to sort of draw a distinction between what's research and what's learning, and research is what we want to write up and tell other people about, and learning is just, you know, not something we want to write up and tell other people about. And I just don't think that that's a useful distinction anymore. And then the third thing I wanted to highlight is this one of including local knowledge, and there was very little of that mentioned in what you talked about from the group discussion. Again, if you look at agroecology principles, you'll see that local knowledge features strongly. Local knowledge here means knowledge that's gained through experience and interacting with the environment. Okay, so it's the knowledge that farmers and other people have because of what they do. They do farming. It can be recently acquired or it can be long-term. If it's been around for a long time, people call it traditional knowledge, but there's local knowledge which is recently acquired as well. It's acquired through sort of informal processes, not through sitting in training courses and not through doing sort of formalized experimentation and data collection. And it's validated just by experience in a casual way, and it's actually something that we all do all the time, every day of our lives. But it's importance to include in our research and to build on in our research. The diagram on that slide there shows some types and relationships between local knowledge and scientific knowledge, and also brings up a third category, which is often not articulated so clearly, and that was what we call sort of public policy knowledge. The things that maybe a Minister of Agriculture says, you know, it's just obvious that something happens, and actually when you look into it, it's not obvious at all. It's obvious within some areas of debate. Within some groups of people say it's obvious, it's well known. For example, that, you know, farms in Africa need more fertilizer. In many people talking about agriculture in Africa say that's accepted. We just have to find ways of getting more fertilizer. And yet we know, as scientists, we know that there are some alternatives. And in some local knowledge can also understand that there are alternatives just to increasing fertilizer use. All right, that's not what I want to get into. What I want to get into here is, why is it so important to bring local knowledge into discussion at each stage in the research cycle? And the first point, again, is it's the right thing to do. Disregarding somebody else's knowledge is simply wrong. If somebody disregarded your knowledge and understanding, just that's irrelevant. I'm not going to listen to that. I'm not going to take account of that in what we're talking about. You would be offended. And farmers have a right to be offended when we as researchers disregard what they know. Yeah, I describe it as a right. Recognizing it, talking about it, building it into what you do helps to build relationships and mutual respect. Okay? If you want to have a good relationship with farmers, and that good relationship is absolutely necessary, you can't do anything without it, then recognizing, acknowledging, building on, discussing what they know is going to help build those relationships. Okay. It recognizes that there are multiple knowledge systems and that there are gaps in science. One of the features of science is that, you know, we think it's kind of absolute. It describes the way the world is, the way the nature really is. And to some extent that's true, but it's hugely imperfect. There are lots of things that science has nothing to say about, or it has nothing to say about yet. And we know that things that science had, conclusions that science had reached, are being updated and changed all the time. So scientific knowledge isn't as absolute as we sometimes like to think, and acknowledging local knowledge is sort of recognizing that as well. So that local knowledge will enrich our understanding and insights into what's going on. It'll help us raise more relevant questions and hypotheses and solutions, and it will also help in communications. If we can phrase what we're doing in terms of local knowledge, then it might make more sense to some of the farmers we're talking to. I think it's important to realize that local knowledge isn't sort of flawless. Not everything is known by farmers. If it was, we wouldn't need to engage with them at all. And there's some obvious areas where local knowledge is likely to be limited. For example, new problems. I remember when fall armyworm first arrived in the region, and one or two people went around asking farmers for their, what's your local knowledge about managing this disease? And of course, this pest. And of course, there wasn't any because it newly arrived. It's never been seen before. So don't expect farmers to have useful local knowledge for newly emerging problems. Don't expect farmers who are recent arrivals in that environment to have knowledge which is specific to that environment. And don't expect farmers to have a lot of useful local knowledge on things which are essentially invisible. So soil microbes, for example, they can't be seen or smelt or felt. It's unlikely that farmers are going to have a lot of local knowledge about soil microbes and what they're doing. But the fact that there are some gaps in local knowledge is not a reason for ignoring the local knowledge that is there. Okay, so there were three things which underpin, they're not the only three, but there are three things which underpin anything we're doing when we're thinking of engaging farmers around that research cycle: the co-creation, thinking about research and learning, and including local knowledge. So, as I said, the remainder of these sessions, we're going to look at the next one, which I think is in 2 weeks' time, on research design. We'll have one around data collection and data handling, and one on data analysis and interpreting. And I'm going to stop there and give a chance. Look at that, we're exactly at the bottom of the hour. But let's just, if anybody wants to give a quick question, a comment on anything, then now is your chance. You can open your microphone and shout out, or you can put up your hand, or you can put it in the chat. Would it be relevant to similar problems? Yeah, I mean, okay. So exactly. Maybe, how do you handle another stem borer? Or something like that. Yes, you might learn something relevant to fall armyworm from how you handle another pest. But when we're asking now about knowledge, let's be clear. Let's ask sensible questions. So the sensible question is, how do you handle caterpillar? How do you deal with caterpillars that are eating your maize? Not how do you deal with fall armyworm. We'll see you again in 2 weeks' time.